Greetings chess endgame fans, and welcome to the first of two videos looking at endings played in the 2020 US Chess Championships. Now, due to the pandemic, this tournament was played online at the rapid time control of 25 minutes plus 5 seconds increment per move. As usual, accurate endgame play in rapid chess is practically impossible. But what the format does generate, though, are opportunities that a working knowledge of endings can enable a player to seize. Now, the competition was a 12-player all-play-all event, and it was eventually won by Wesley So with the excellent score of 9 points out of 11. And in the next video, we're going to look at one of Wesley So's games. But first up is a rook and pawn ending. And playing white was Grandmaster Hikaru Nakamura, a pre-tournament favourite and one of the world's best rapid players, and a 4-time winner of the United States Championship. And his opponent playing black is Grandmaster Alexander Lenderman, winner of the 2015 World Open. Now, before we go any further, the Worldsman would just like to say that all of the positions that are chosen for analysis are chosen for their instructional value. And all players make mistakes, and absolute respect to both of these grandmasters who were playing this ending out at a rapid time control. Now, the evaluation of these positions, moreover, is not straightforward. It's not easy at all, although understanding of them was advanced greatly in the early 20th century by the pioneer analysts Andrei Sharon and subsequently Nikolai Grigoriev. And what can we say about this position? Well, the key thing is that black's pieces are not optimally placed. The rook would stand much better on g8, and the black king should really be closer to the queening square, or if it is on the c-file, then higher up the board. And because of where the king and the rook currently stand, this is going to be a very difficult position for black to defend. So what I'd like to do is just put the white rook on d2, and we'll put the black king higher up the board on c4. And we'll take a look at this position with the rook on g7, which is lost for black if black has the move, and with the rook on g8, and this position in contrast is a draw if black has the move. So let's see why this is the case. So the key thing that black really needs to do in endings like this is to maintain threats. And as we'll see, what black needs to do is play a move that either checks white's king or attacks an undefended pass pawn, or which harasses the white rook. And if black is able to do this in a sustained way, then he will win. And conversely, what white wants to do is to push that pass pawn to get g4 and g5 in. And if white's able to do that, then white will win. So black starts off by playing this rook h8 check. White goes king g4. Black has another check available. And now white goes king f5. And here black's got a choice. He can either play rook f8 check, or he can play a move attacking the enemy rook. So let's attack the rook. Let's go king c3. And here, probably white's best try is to go rook a2. And rook a2 tempts black to play king d3. It's very tempting to try and get the king over. But that would be a big mistake, because king d3 doesn't attack anything. It doesn't give a check. And it just gives white a free move to play g4, which is winning. So black shouldn't do that. Instead, he should play one of his other available options, which is to give a check on f8. And after white goes king g6, then black has another check available. He can go rook g8 check, to which white can reply king f7, attacking the rook. And now black can't give a check. He can't attack the enemy rook because his own rook's attacked, and he can't really attack the white g-pawn because that's defended by the rook on a2. But what he can do is to play the move rook g4. And what this move does is it prevents white from playing g4. It actually occupies the g4 square. And it's going to take white 2 moves to harass the enemy rook with his king. So that's a completely playable defensive move by black, because it's stopping white from carrying out his main winning plan. White could go king f6. And now notice that king d3 is still bad, because white can go king f5. Again, black doesn't have a check available, can't attack the rook. The pawn's defended, so the rook would have to give way, and then white will go g4, which is winning. So instead, black can't give a check either here, because if he goes rook f4 check, then white has king g5, and again g4 is coming. So by process of elimination, if black can't give a check, can't attack the enemy pawn, then the only thing left to do is to attack the enemy rook. So black goes king b3. And now after rook e2, again black doesn't really have a check. If he goes rook f4, then white still goes king g5, followed by g4. Can't attack the rook, the pawn's already attacked. So what black does is to just move his rook back again, maintaining control of the g4 square, so white can't go g4. And again, black on g8, black is maximising the checking distance. After king f5, he can go rook f8 check. After king g4, he can go rook g8 check. After king f3, he can go rook f8 check. So now the only idea for white is to try and hide behind the passed pawn to get out of the checks. So white goes king g3. After rook g8 check, he goes king f2. And after rook f8 check, he goes king g1. And here black still has to be careful. So if he plays the careless move king c3, then white is able to cut the black king off along the 4th rank by going rook e4. So instead black should avoid that by going king c4. And now after white pushes the pawn with g4, black attacks it rook g8, white defends with rook e4 check, but black's king gets over this 4th rank and goes king d5. And this leads to a theoretically drawn position. We won't demonstrate the draw in this video, but you should check this for yourself after the video, that this position is in fact a draw. Okay. So let's go back. And instead of putting the rook on g8, we'll see what happens if instead the rook is on g7, again giving black the move. And we'll see that moving the rook one rank up the board has a huge influence on the outcome, because this position is now lost for black. Let's see what happens after black tries rook h7 check. Now white meets this move by going king g4. Notice that white should not go king g3 though, because this gives black the opportunity to go rook h8, transposing into the ending that we've just established as a draw. So instead white goes king g4. And after rook g7 check, white goes king f5. And now black will try harassing. He can go king c3. As before, white goes rook a2. Black again harasses the rook with king b3. And now the white rook comes to e2, 2 squares away, because it can't be attacked by the black king anymore. So the only useful move black has got is to give a check. Rook f7. White goes king g6. Black goes rook f4 to guard that g4 square. But now the rook is closed down. White goes king g5. And now black can't give a check, can't attack the pawn, can't keep control of g4, and can't attack the enemy rook. So that rook is going to have to give ground, g4 is going to follow, and this position is an easy win for white. Okay, well, having done this exploratory analysis, let's return to the game position. Now, with white to move, Nakamura would be happy. He can go rook d2, or he can go g4 immediately, and we've established that they're both winning ideas. But in this position, it was Lenderman to move, and Lenderman had a choice here. He could improve the position of his king by going king d6, or he could improve the position of his rook by going rook g8. So the question is, well, what decision should black take here? Should he improve the position of the king or the rook? So if you'd like to try and decide this for yourself, we'll pause the video here and have a look at the position and see if you can work out what the best move is. Okay, well, welcome back if you tackled this. So let's first of all see what happens if black decides to improve the position of the rook by going rook g8. So white immediately cuts the king off by going rook d2. And we'll see that the black king is worse placed on c7 than it was on c4 when we looked at this setup previously, and as we'll see, this makes a big difference to the outcome of the game. On c7, the black king stands much less well. So black goes rook h8 check, white goes king g4, black keeps up the checks, and now white goes king f3. It's very important that the king doesn't rush forward. In fact, the king is going to retreat for a bit. After rook f8, white goes king e2, and after rook e8 check, white goes king f2. And after rook f8 check, then you can see white's idea is to hide behind the pawn. White goes king g1. So the only really useful move for black here is to go rook g8, at least staying on the g2 pawn. But this gives white time to improve his position. He can go rook d3. And notice that the rook d3 wouldn't be possible if black's king was on c4. Well, black's king tries to come higher up the board, so it can get into a position where it can harass the rook. White goes g3. Black goes king c5, and now white's king occupies the square that the pawn is vacated, goes king g2. And finally the black king arrives at c4. So the white rook falls back to d1. And now what is black to do? Well, I mean, the rook is already optimally placed on g8, so black really has to move the king. So he goes king c5. White king finally comes out from behind its shelter, so the rook checks. Now the white king can come forward because the pawn is on the third rank. Black goes rook e8 check. White goes king f4. Black goes rook f8 check. And the white king keeps advancing. He goes to e5. Black rook checks again on e8, and white goes king f6. And after black goes rook f8 check, white goes king g7. And the point of the pawn being on the third rank rather than the second rank is that it means that white will be able to close the rook down, whereas previously white was not able to do this. So here, well, black's got a choice, but both choices are going to lead to the same outcome. So black can go rook f3, but white just goes rook g1, and he's going to push. He's going to go g4, g5, which is winning. or black can go rook f5, but now the rook is closed down, white can go king g6. The rook has to give way, and that's going to give white the opportunity to go g4, g5. So rook g8 is insufficient and would be a losing move. So congratulations if instead you took the decision to improve the position of your king by going king d6. That was completely correct. Okay, and that's what Lenderman in fact played in the game. Just get rid of that. Nakamura replied by going rook e2. Now this cuts the king off from the passed pawn, but it only cuts the king off by 2 files rather than 3 files as previously. Black played rook h7 check, and Nakamura went king g4. So the question here is what should black play now in this position? Now if you've been paying attention to the analysis so far, it shouldn't be too difficult to find the right move here. If you like to think about it, pause the video again here. Okay, well, welcome back if you had a go working this one out. And if you chose the move rook h8, well, very well done. This is going to lead to a draw. Let's see why. White goes king f5, black goes rook f8 check, white goes king g6, and now black plays a very important move. He plays the move king d5, and this takes the e4 square away from white's rook, and that's important because on e4 the rook would guard g4, which is the square that white wishes to advance the pawn to. White attacks the rook comes to f4. Notice that because the pawn is on g2, there's an extra rank, and so it's not going to be possible for white to close that rook down. After king g6, again black can go rook f8, back to the first rank. Now it looks as though white can make progress though, because g4 is possible. But after g4, black goes rook g8 check, and after king f5, white goes rook f8 check. After king g5, black goes rook g8 check, and after king f4, black goes rook f8 check. And now white has to shelter behind the pawn. He goes king g3, and now black plays another important move. He plays rook g8, keeping up the attack on the g pawn, and that very much restricts white's options. So to make progress, white can try rook e7. Black immediately attacks the rook, and after the rook comes to the e4 square, again it's important that black immediately attacks the rook again. So to make progress, the rook now has to leave the e file, come to the f file, and this allows black's king to come closer to the queening square, to rook f5 check. The black king falls back to e6, and now after say rook king f4, then black can move his rook to the long side of the pawn, go to a8, to rook b5, then the king is coming to f6, and again this is a standard drawn position. Black's been able to improve the position of his king so much that it's now relatively straightforward to hold the draw. Okay. So let's go back. let's go back to this position. Okay, now unfortunately in the game, instead of playing Rook h8, Lenderman was tempted to give the check Rook g7 check. And this was a big mistake because it allowed the move King f5. And after Rook g3, then this position was reached. And the problem is that Black's Rook is misplaced on g3. And in fact, Nakamura had a choice of two winning moves here, although both moves has the same basic idea. So the first winning move would have been King f6, exploiting the fact that there's no check on f3. And the threat is to play Rook d2 check, forcing Black's king further away from the passed pawn. And if Black were to go King d5 here, then White has Rook e5 check, followed by Rook g5, followed by advancing the pawn. So that would be winning. So that was the first winning idea. And then the second winning idea was just to go Rook e6 check, taking a direct approach. And after King d7, then White goes Rook g6. And after Black's Rook goes to the long side of the pawn, then there's an important move that you play here. You don't go g4 allowing King e7, you go King f6. You don't allow Black to play King e7 here. And after Rook a6 check, you go King f7, and your king has penetrated decisively, and that would be sufficient to win. Okay. So let's go back again. Rook g7, King f5, Rook g3. But instead of going for one of these options, instead Nakamura let the wind slip, and he played the move King f4. And this was a mistake, and Lenderman defended very precisely from here because he dropped his rook back to g8, which is an excellent move. And although this allows g4, Black is able to implement the distance defense. Played Rook f8 check, and after King g3, he played Rook g8 check. It doesn't allow g5. That's why Rook g8 staying on the pawn is the right move here. And this position is now drawn. Having said that, Nakamura did his best to try and win it. He played a very sneaky move. He played Rook e1. And Black has to be a bit careful here. And a mistake would be to play the move King d7, because this allows White's rook access to this key e4 square. On e4, the rook defends g4, and the rook can't be attacked in a single move. So if Black were to go, let's say, King d6, then White can go King f4, and the White king is going to penetrate and push the pawn forward. So instead, after Rook e1, Lenderman played the correct King d5, keeping control of that e4 square. So Nakamura went Rook e7, and this set another trap. So if the Black king were to go forward in this position, then White would have Rook h7. And after King e5, then White has this clever move Rook h6. And notice how the Rook controls e6 and f6, the pawn controls f5, and White's king controls f4. So the Black king is boxed in. There isn't a useful move for the Rook. The king is going to have to give way, and that's going to allow White to play moves like King h4, and followed by g5. But instead, Lenderman was once more equal to the challenge, and instead of King d4, he played the correct king d6 attacking the rook. And now Nakamura went back, he played rook e2, and the game was eventually drawn 87 moves later. Let's just see why rook h7 doesn't work. And it doesn't work because black can go king e6. And after king h4 he can go king f6. And again his king is now very active, holding the draw. Whereas if we compare this with the previous line, king d4, rook h7, king e5, rook h6. So here black's king has to give way, goes king e4, and this gives time for white to play king h4. And there's a trick. King f4 doesn't work because of rook f6 check. And after king e5, then white has got g5 protecting the rook. To rook h8 check, white goes king g4. And now what black has to try defense from the rear, so he goes rook h1. White can drop his rook back to f2. And after king e6, white can go g6. And that pawn is going to win the game. Okay, so what are the takeaways from this ending? Well, if you're the defender, it's keep up your threats. That's vital. A check or attack the pawn or harass the enemy rook. Do something, and only play an alternative move if there's just no way that your opponent can take advantage of it by pushing the passed pawn, and that's usually going to mean making a move that controls the square that the pawn wants to advance to. If you're the attacker, then if you have the opportunity to cut off your enemy's king along a file or along a rank, then go for it. That's going to be good. If you can close down the enemy rook and get in g4, g5, or b4, b5 if it's a b pawn, then that's very likely going to be winning for you. Penetrate with the king, and be aware of the fact that you can use the g pawn to shelter your king, and that can be the winning strategy. Okay, thank you for watching.